everyone. John Adams here, formerly of MMOEmulators.com and a myriad of other emulator-related projects since the year 2006. I am not particularly famous or even relevant, though I do claim the honor of rescuing the massively multiplayer online role-playing game called Vanguard, Saga of Heroes from certain death, when Sony Online Games decided to shut down that game forever on July 31st of 2014. I had already been building an emulator of this MMORPG along with an amazing team of volunteer developers long before Sony's sunset, but we'll talk more about that later. So who is this John Adams character? I have been an extremely casual gamer since the early 80s, starting on original consoles like the Atari 2600, and then onto an Atari 800 XL with a tape loader. Yes, I am that old. and finally in 1986 acquiring my first PCs, namely a Commodore 128 and an IBM PC clone called the K-Pro. My first PC games were Starflight, which I still play today if you can believe it, and of course games like Zork, Hitchhiker's Guide, Ultima 4, and Bard's Tale. Almost every game I played on the personal computers I had a character name of Johnzus, because that was my first Dungeons & Dragons character when I played D&D with friends as a kid in the late 1970s. Also during the 80s, I stood up a World War IV bulletin board system called the Enchanted Attic, with a pirate side running Searchlight BBS called TESS, which stood for The Edge Secret Society. I thought I was so badass. My sysop name on the bulletin boards became John Adams, and thus my moniker was born around 1986. I still use Johnzus for single-player games, but the public face of TESS was Mr. John Adams. The bulletin board TESS was online from 1986 until death by internet in 1996, which was a really sad day. In the early 90s, the IBM clones took me away from the Commodore when I switched my home music production efforts to Cakewalk Pro Audio, and then discovered PC-based games like Doom, Master of Orion 2, Sid Meier's Civilization, and the Heroes of Might and Magic series. By the late 90s, gaming became a little bit more of an obsession for me because throughout the 90s I found myself working with software developers and becoming fascinated with building programs and games, and when the internet happened, I got into building websites. It was around 1998 that I learned that there was even such a thing as playing co-op or against your buddies online in games like Quake or Unreal Tournament, and of course my beloved Heroes of Might and Magic. In 2001, my life as I know it came to an end when somebody introduced me to Everquest. That was it. I became one of the obsessed, but not with the end game or loot or even the social aspect of MMOs, but I was dying to know how they did this. I wanted to take this game apart so bad and learn how to build these multiplayer games, but sadly I was not a software engineer, and most of the programming I ever did was in PHP building website apps. I became quite the online gamer in the 2000s, trying out Dark Age of Camelot, which I really hated, and then learning of a space MMO called Earth and Beyond, and I loved it. But then another space MMO showed up, EVE Online, and wow did I love that game. It was fun for a while, but then got a little ganky and my casual ass couldn't survive, so I hung up my clone pod. Shortly after this, in 2004, Everquest 2 came out and my whole guild hopped from EQ to EQ2 to check it out. It was a good run for 2 to 3 years. World of Warcraft also came out at the same time, but I personally didn't like it. It felt too cartoony, so I never really played it beyond the free trial. 3 years into EQ2, Vanguard Saga of Heroes landed, and literally everyone I knew flocked to that because it was the latest Brad McQuaid creation. I absolutely loved Vanguard despite the horrendous bugs at launch and missing content because I was playing with the Raiders from EQ. It was my first ever endgame experience. I was like a kid on Christmas, chunk crashes be damned. However, player bleeding over to WoW pretty much killed our efforts in Vanguard, and by 2008, I ultimately hung up my MMORPG guns for good. But there's a good reason for this, because while the public MMO scene was fading for me, something else amazing had happened in 2006. While I was whining to a friend one day about how sucky all our MMO games had become, he told me there was this EQ Emulator out there. I had no idea what that meant. At best, I assumed someone built a 3D graphics simulator that ran on your PC locally to walk through game files. But holy damn, this was a real thing. This was the answer to all my prayers on how to build an online game. And it wasn't just an online game. It was an MMORPG that would have been completely impossible for me to figure out on my own, let alone even know how to ask anyone to help me. Here was the source code. Here was a database. Here was the Everquest Titanium client. And bam, I was running an Everquest server of my own. I will get more into the details of these emulators in future videos, but suffice it to say, this was not the last life-changing event over the next 10 years. After this discovery, now that I knew what keywords to search for, I began looking for other MMO emulators. And lo and behold, there were many. EQ2 was started by Lethal Encounter, EVE Online was started by Zur, Earth and Beyond was started by Blasty99, I think his name was. And there were dozens, if not hundreds, of World of Warcraft emulator projects, both code and data out there. The rabbit hole was wide and deep, and I fell in without even trying to slow my descent into madness. As I started collecting more and more MMO emulators, I got this harebrained idea one day in early 2007 that I would stand up a hub of sorts to connect all of my emulators together into a one-stop shop, so to speak, where players could come to one place and launch themselves into any of a dozen emulator projects that I was running. That resulted in me registering my first ever domain on the internet called MMOEmulators.com. I still have that domain today, although it has gone through a number of reboots over the last 15 years, starting out as a game server portal for managing accounts since I had these web development skills that were going to waste, and then progressing to a community forum for all the different game emulators, and now finally today it's simply a blog for me to ramble about my game experience. I won't get into all the MMO emulator projects I got myself involved with in this video, but I do want to talk about the two most important ones to me. To talk about Everquest 2 Emulator, I'm going to need a couple of very long videos. I learned of the project in late 2008 and wandered over to do the usual, grab the source code, grab the data, and run my own server. However, what happened next still feels like a dream. The project lead was Lethal Encounter, and he was so great to work with that I kept getting more and more involved in the project. I am a QA engineer in real life, so testing is kind of my thing. Eventually, I ended up being his community manager and DBA and organizing content designers to build the worlds. In 2011, Lethal Encounter retired from gaming development altogether, and I took over the Everquest 2 project as project lead, and the rest we'll save for that epic video series on Everquest 2 Emulator. I was very proud of this project and my role on it for years. I played endgame Vanguard Saga of Heroes from 2007 to 2009, but most of my guild left the game due to intolerance for bugs or lack of content, so every few months or so I would sign in and say hi to the remaining guildmates, just hanging around. By 2011, it was apparent the server populations were in decline, and you know what usually happens next. I predicted the end of Vanguard and started looking for sharp developers willing to help me emulate this amazing game before it vanished forever. The first guy to help was Zinix, a data structures and content designer for Everquest 2 Emulator. We spent time over the next 2 years trying to understand Ramsey's Vanguard Saga of Hero packets and Sony crypto, until finally August of 2013, Scatman, another developer from the EQ2 Emulator project, offered to help us build a Vanguard login and world server from scratch. And we did. We had a login server by September of 2013 and a world server by October, and thanks to a very diligent team of hack and crackin' wizards, we got logged into the world by January of 2014. And 3 weeks later, Sony Online Entertainment announces the end of Vanguard in August of 2014. I'll dive deeper into the story in the VGO emulator videos. You do love cliffhangers, don't you? To wrap this lengthy introduction up, this is just the tip of the iceberg of who John Adams is, or was, as I have now retired from game development myself, and a glimpse into some of the projects I have proudly supported and have been involved with over the last 15 years. It isn't fame or glory that I seek, or clearly I would not be using an alias, but instead I want to celebrate some of the best times of my life spent building worlds that others can enjoy, and I really do love telling stories. I hope you enjoy these brief intro videos with previews of things to come. If you did, please consider tapping that like button so these videos can see the light of day, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next one. Thank you for watching.